Hey, and welcome to Be the Bridge. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner. From the time I was 11, I tried to pray away the gay. But my senior year in college, I realized I could pray and be gay. Each week, I'll share my experiences and chat with others as we build a bridge between the LGBT community and people of faith. Thanks for joining, and let the construction begin. Hello, fellow bridge builders. Thank you all for joining me today for this episode of Be the Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Brian Peyton Joyner, author of the novel The Wisdom of Stones. The novel's about Ben, a college senior, who promised God and his meemaw he'd be a Southern Baptist preacher, but he can't pray away the gay. Now, I've gone to many book events to promote The Wisdom of Stones, and I always enjoy meeting fellow writers. At a holiday event at the Palm Desert Westfield Mall, I had the opportunity to get to know award-winning author, Dr. Paula Trimble-Familetti. As a kid, Dr. Paula's favorite subject was Sunday school. She earned a BA in religion from Chapman College. She taught school for many years and then one day decided to pursue a master's degree in religion. Of all places, she elected to attend Liberty University without really understanding the nature of that very, very conservative school. And then many years later, she earned her Doctor of Ministry in International Feminist Theology from San Francisco Theological Seminary. Her book, Prostitutes, Virgins, and Mothers, Questioning Teachings About Biblical Women, is a must-read for anyone who wants to better understand the Bible and the important role that women have played both in Judaism and in Christianity. I read her book, and it has inspired me to dive deeper into this fascinating area of biblical study. Dr. Paula, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian.
It was so great meeting you at the book event back in December. And from looking at the cover of your book, Prostitutes, Virgins, and Mothers, Questioning Teachings About Biblical Women, I knew it was a book I wanted to read. And after talking with you, I knew you were a guest I wanted to have on the show.
Thank you.
First question I like to ask everyone is, where are you from? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Des Moines, Iowa. I was raised in Indio, California.
What was your religious background like? Were your parents conservative religiously?
No, I was raised going to a Disciple of Christ church, which is traditionally a very liberal tradition. I was taught at an early age that it was the thinking man's church, and I wondered why it was just men that were doing the thinking. And so my parents were not particularly conservative.
Did you go to that church your entire childhood?
I went to that church until 1980-something when I felt called to become a Roman Catholic. Okay. And I became a Roman Catholic, and now I call myself a roaming Catholic because I find it difficult to give my allegiance to an institution which does not recognize the God-given gifts of women.
Right. That was a big issue for me growing up because I couldn't understand in the Southern Baptist tradition why women were not seen as being capable of preaching to the entire congregation. Because I saw women that were as eloquent, that were smart, that had everything that the preacher had and then some, but for some reason they weren't allowed to preach in the church. And that was really the first chink in the armor of starting to question that Southern Baptist tradition. So I'm curious what the progression was. We were in a fairly liberal denomination. Why did you go from that to wanting to be a Roman Catholic? What was the calling like?
It was that. It was a calling. And I guess it's because my husband and I he's Catholic. Okay. And so we would go to the Disciples Church when we were in town, and we would go to the Roman Church when we were out of town because you can always find one open. And I love the ritual. And I just felt called, and I didn't want to become a Catholic. And it was one of those things, they light candles, leave me alone. They worship saints, leave me alone. And finally, the calling was so overwhelming that I just said, fine, if you will leave me alone, I will do it.
I'm always interested in callings because I've had many of those instances in my life. And for me, it was an instantaneous voice-like calling where I was one way before and then I was different after. It wasn't all of a sudden that my actions were that different, but in terms of what I knew I needed to do, it was boom. Was it like that for you?
It probably was, but I fought it. There's one time when I know that I followed the call instantaneously, and it was my last year of teaching kindergarten. And I was having a very difficult time with some of the parents, and I was in love with the children. And walking from my room to the staff lounge, I said, God, why am I having such a hard time with these parents? With children like this, I could do this forever. And that still small voice said, Paula, you're not supposed to be here. And I went, what you just said, oh. And so I made arrangements to retire.
Wow. So let's talk about your schooling. You went to Chapman College.
For my BA in religion. And then when it was time to get a master's, even though I was teaching in public school, I knew the only thing I wanted to study was religion. And at that time, I couldn't afford to quit my job and lose my insurance and go for a master's. At that time, Liberty University had distance learning. They were one of the first schools to have distance learning. So I signed up for that, having no idea what Liberty University was all about. And that
So you did no research on them? You didn't realize it was Jerry Falwell's school and was uber conservative?
Oh my goodness. It was a terrifying experience when I had to do my residency there. But I got my MA, and in a way I'm really glad that I went, because it kind of gave me the focus of where I needed to go in reclaiming my faith from what those people had turned it into.
One of the interesting things in your book is when you talk about translations and the way that a certain word in Greek is translated, if it's referring to a man, as a minister, translated as servant with regards to a woman.
The specific instance I think I use in the book is when Jesus goes to the home of Peter, and Peter's mother-in-law is ill. And just a few chapters earlier, Jesus has been in the wilderness, and the word is translated as the angels ministered to him. But after the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, she gets up and serves them. And it's just in a few verses of each other that it's translated differently for angels than for a woman.
Wow. Was that something that was very consistent in your theology school? Did they explain why the word was translated one way?
Not at Liberty, because they're perfectly comfortable with that.
Right.
Women serve, angels minister. At Chapman, yes, because it was a more liberal education. It was a wonderful theological education. And then with the doctorate in International Feminist Theology, San Francisco Theological Seminary is a very liberal school.
I don't know how your head didn't explode going from Liberty University to University of San Francisco. I guess that gave you a unique perspective.
It did, because I saw and experienced how the enemy really thinks. And I'm going to use this one example. We had a breakout session in class, and I don't remember what the conversation was, but I said something to the effect of, I think it's a disgrace that the United States uses 80% of the world's resources, and we're 20% of the world's population. And one of the women in the group said, oh no, it's because we're a Christian nation. If they were a Christian nation, they could have 80% of the world's resources too. So my first thought was, well, she's not a math major.
Yeah. Wow.
And not a lot of geopolitical understanding going on here.
Right.
And that was the attitude that I experienced pretty much across the board.
Did you have men and women studying together in your classes at Liberty?
Yes.
The men in the class, they were aspiring to be ministers, professors?
Yes.
What were the women in the class aspiring to do with their theology degrees?
Preachers' wives.
Really? Were they already married to a preacher, or they saw that as the...
I don't really know, because I kind of left as soon as my school day was over, and I didn't make a lot of friends or contacts. My sister had gone with me, so we just kind of hung out, and I did whatever schoolwork I needed to do, but...
How long were the residencies?
It was 2 weeks.
Okay.
A terrifying 2 weeks.
So while you were at Liberty, I assume you had tests and papers that you had to do. Did you ever express your own views on women or other issues about the Bible as when you were answering questions or doing papers at Liberty?
I did not, because I knew that there would be no openness to that. In class, there weren't discussions. It was the professor standing at the front of the class telling us what we believed.
When you were at Liberty, did you tell people you were Catholic?
I didn't even wear my miraculous medal when I was on campus because Catholics were a joke. And I heard many jokes about Catholics in classes. And I tried not to expose myself at all because there was no openness to anything but this is what we believe, and so this is what you will believe. And here is the proof text.
What would have been the consequences if you had said something? Would it have been just grades, or could you have been expelled from the program?
I might have been expelled. It might have been just grades. There's no just to that, but it might have been grades. But I think I could have probably been expelled. I knew what I had to regurgitate to get through the program once I finally understood that it wasn't like my BA. This was very dictated. And so once I figured that out, then I just memorized.
Right. After you graduated, did you feel like you had satisfied that calling? And
Yes.
then what did you do after you graduated?
I knew that I had to get an MA. And I walked into the house, and television was on in the afternoon, which it never is, and there was a commercial for this distance learning MA. And I went, yay, I'll take that. And I did. And I'm glad that I did it because it gave me a window into something I would have never imagined. And I knew that that was what I was supposed to do after it was over. Although going through it, it's like, what have I gotten myself into? But I knew that that's what I had to do. And when I finally made it to seminary, I was kind of the oddity because people wanted to see the woman that went to Liberty University. And there was even a game that we played to get to know each other where people had postcards on their back and you had to walk around and give people clues to, and I looked at one guy's postcard and I went, oh, you're me. So it opened me up to more experiences. It was really terrifying when I was there, but it kind of gave me the focus of writing this book because so much of what I heard them say about women didn't fit what I believed that I felt like I needed to bring another perspective.
Right. So after you graduated from Liberty with that MA, you went back to teaching school?
Correct, I did.
Were you a different person at that point? Did that allow you to deal with those parents better? What was your mindset after you'd finished that MA?
No, at that point, it was the subject that I wanted to study to move on the pay scale. Even though I felt called to study religion, I had said at one time that I wanted to be a college professor. Somehow I trusted Desert Sands Unified School District the way my father had, because he had been a teacher in DSUSD. I trusted that more than I trusted what I felt called to do. Oh, and then in the interim, my husband broke his back, so somebody needed a job right now.
Right.
So, life gets in the way of your plans sometimes.
So you worked for about 10 years before you decided to pursue a doctorate in ministry. How did you come to that decision?
I wanted to get a PhD, and I had started the process of driving up to Claremont on to the School of Theology on Thursday, going to class, spending the night in a motel up there, getting up before dawn and driving back. So I would pack my lunch, my dinner, my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner. No, I didn't have to pack another dinner. And then the I-10 is boom, 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 boom when you're driving. So one day I was driving back and I said, God, I think I'm called to get a doctorate, but I can't do this for 7 years or however long it'll take to get a PhD. And I used to take a subscription to Christian Century. And I got home from work that day, and my copy of Christian Century was in the mailbox. And I opened it up, and there was an advertisement like it had my name on it. It said, Paula, are you longing to study International Feminist Theology in an inclusive, and I don't remember what it said after that, because I said, yes, I am. What do I have to do? So I wrote the paper and filled out the application and whatever else I was supposed to do. And by summer, I was accepted in the program.
Wow.
Yay.
So in that regard, the voice was even louder than before, where it just came in, you prayed about it, and then God immediately answered that prayer.
That's
and
what
you
it
knew
felt
exactly where you needed to go. So what was it like showing up on that first day of orientation and meeting all the folks? Describe that for us.
It was heaven. So you fly into San Francisco Airport and you get on a bus that takes you to the landing. I can't remember the first part of the landing, but it's right over the bridge in Marin County. And then you get a taxi which takes you to school and to the hall where they're having the barbecue. And so I just started meeting all of these fabulous global feminists. They're from all over the world. It is truly an international feminist theology. Some of us are from Nigeria and from Sweden and from Mexico and from Costa Rica and just all over the world and India. And when we would go walking, we would go into San Francisco and most of the sisters were dressed in the clothes from their country. And I have pictures that are of the sisters, but you can see all the people around the periphery going, kind of looking us up and down and wondering what this group of women is. But it was fabulous. I loved it. Every year that I was there, it was absolutely wonderful.
Why were these women pursuing this level of advanced degree?
Well, one of them, a tiny little sister from India, her mission is to save all of the young women who are burned alive because they don't have a big enough dowry. And I don't remember the number of women she had saved, but it was quite significant.
Wow. Another
woman from India has the largest Christian congregation in the country. One of my friends from Nigeria, she wants to teach, or at the time wanted to teach at the university, and she wanted to teach feminist theology at the university. So they all had different goals, but they all wanted to study feminist theology. And our professor, Letty Russell, and her partner, Shannon Clarkson, they're rock stars in the feminist theological community. And so lots of people came so that they could study with Letty and Shannon.
Right. What was your first class at that seminary?
I don't remember the names of the classes. Basically, every class was building on the one before. So that the first class, we read feminist authors from all over the globe. So we had an idea of the different issues that different women faced. Women experience oppression in different ways, and the Bible is used in different cultures to facilitate that oppression. And so we needed to have a background in what our sisters were experiencing so that we didn't just bring in my case, my limited, white, comfortable, middle-class feminist views. I needed to know what was going on with other people. What was going on with my sister that saved young women who were being burned alive.
Right. At what point did you get the idea to write a book about women in the Bible?
I think it was always in the back of my mind. Like I said, I had thought that I should be a professor and teach religion and teach feminist theology and write. And then I wrote the dissertation, so that was like writing a book, and I went, oh, well, I could do this. And then the day I sat down to write it, I basically started with chapter 1, and in the introduction I say, I am called to write this book. There is nothing else I can do. I have to do this. So that happened maybe a little bit before I retired from teaching, but they were more or less simultaneous. Then these women, I say they spoke to me, and I wrote their stories from a woman's perspective.
I love that aspect of the book, and that's one thing I think that makes it truly unique. You tell stories that many of us are familiar with, but looking at it from the woman's perspective. For instance, when Abraham takes Sarah's son and Sarah's son Isaac up to be sacrificed, we get nothing of Sarah's view and all of that. And as you tell her story in the book, it is revelational, because I don't think many people even realize that they're getting just the man's perspective, and that there are these women doing all these things, that they actually were not just property as they were treated in the Old Testament, but these were human beings that had emotions and feelings and were shocked, I'm sure, that their husband would do something like that without consulting with them.
Even in the New Testament, the heroes of faith, Abraham is said to take his only son, to be willing to sacrifice his only son. And if you actually read it, it was Sarah's only son. He had another one that he really liked.
Right.
Because the stories of women have been told by men, the fact that that was Sarah's only son is totally left out. The fact that Hagar's only son gets the exact same promise as Sarah's only son is left out too.
So what was it like writing that book? Was it cathartic? Was it scary? Was it exciting? Was it frightening?
It was cathartic. It wasn't scary.
So who is the audience for your book? Who did you want to read it? And is that who ultimately picked up a copy?
I wanted to translate the conclusions of feminist theology from the academy to the pew.
Okay.
I wanted to present a different perspective on the stories of these women, because a lot of the stories that I read, there is a series of books called Bad Girls of the Bible. And in that series, she writes about a lot of the women. But from what I read, it seemed like it was still the patriarchal interpretation of these women's stories.
And just calling it bad women, they were leaving out the great things that women have contributed to Christianity. So I can see the need for your book.
The title comes out of going to church and sitting in Sunday school or sitting in church, being taught about women, and it seemed like they were all prostitutes, virgins, or mothers. And then it was actually on Mother's Day, because on Mother's Day, the women got to be the deacons and they got to give the sermon. They also got to set out communion and clean up communion, which they did every other Sunday. But this particular Sunday, they got to be up front. And I thought, the minister's a man, the deacons are men, the elders are men, Jesus is a man, God's a man. Where are the women, and why are all the women I'm taught about either prostitutes, virgins, or mothers? Didn't they do anything else?
To me, they were really categorized a lot as tricksters and temptresses.
That's true. I was taught that Bathsheba was a temptress who caused a great man of God to fall. And like I said earlier, Sunday school was always my favorite subject. So I pulled out the Bible and I read her story. And it didn't sound at all to me like she was tempting anybody. She was taking a bath in the privacy of her home. He was spying on her. And in later years, when I started watching The X-Files, I knew that whenever Scully was going to go take a bath, the alien was going to try and eat her. So this was kind of, you've never watched The X-Files. I kind of equated that, years later, way after I had written the book. But that's kind of a motif that happens. A woman goes to take a bath and something bad happens. It's in movies all the time.
So when I wrote my novel, I had hoped that thinking Christians who wanted to know more about homosexuality, who wanted to understand conversion therapy, might pick it up, read it, and experience what Ben went through in the novel and how he tried everything he could to pray away the gay but wasn't successful. They might realize, okay, there's something different here than what I thought before. And I would think that your book would be perfect for some thinking Christians to pick up and read and have a very different view about women in the Bible or even about the Bible itself. Has that been the case at all?
Well, first I want to say that I think thinking Christians, and I'm basing this on my experience at Liberty, already know that. One of my first book signings, we actually had it at the little church I attend in Bermuda Dunes. And there was a couple that walked in, and they were not going to like me. He was mad at me from the beginning, and she was grumpy. But I just got them some water and asked them if they wanted snacks and whatever. And then I did a reading of Leah's story. And by the end of that, she wanted to buy a book.
Wow.
And so I said, do you want me to sign it to both of you or just to one of you? And she her whole demeanor changed. And she said, to me, I'm the woman. Like, right on, sister. The people that we need to reach, that you need to reach and that I need to reach, are those people who haven't thought about whether or not there's a different way to think about somebody being gay, or whether or not there's a different way to think about women in the Bible. So we have our work cut out for us.
Right. So the book is fantastic. We don't have time to go through all of the stories because I would love for you to read a lot of the stories. But maybe what we can do is you can share with us just the general background on 3 stories. Whose story were you most proud to retell from her point of view?
I so saturated myself with their stories. I got every Bible I could get my hands on, and then I got all kinds of books that covered these women's stories. And it was sometimes like they came to me, and I propped the Bible up in front of me, my favorite copy, my favorite translation, and I would read through line by line and then put it into the woman's voice. And one night, Leah of Rachel, Jacob, and woke me up in the middle of the night. And I'm not saying I was channeling anybody, but after saturating myself with her story, this voice in my head said, they say my husband didn't love me.
Right.
But I'm the mother of 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
And I know what was going on in my tent.
Right.
And I kind of thought, could we talk about it in the morning? Because it's 4:00. But I lay there thinking, it's kind of like the patriarchy was driving a wedge between these 2 sisters who were running this family.
Right. Yeah, I've read that story fairly recently as I'm reading the Bible through in the year. And I know Jacob goes to, what's the father's name?
Laban.
Okay, so Jacob goes and he meets Rachel at the well. Mm-hmm. She gives him waters his animals. He goes to Laban because, of course, daughters are property in the Old Testament. So he has to get Laban's permission. Laban arranges this whole marriage, which he thought was to Rachel, but actually was to Leah, Rachel's sister. And Jacob is with her for many years, and he still wants Rachel, and we sort of go back and forth. And Laban is really the one who is the bad guy in this story because he continues to trick Jacob into having to work for him for years and years and years. And when they leave, Jacob basically takes both women with him. Mm-hmm.
plus their 2 slaves who were also bearing children for Jacob.
Right. Now, how is that the biblical family? You mentioned that in the book, and since we're talking about this example, I have to say, of course, marriage is between a man and a woman, and people point to the last verse of Genesis 2, but then the entire rest of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, no one really has that particular family.
There have been people that have espoused biblical family values, and I always ask which one.
Right.
And so they say, well, Jesus' family.
Jesus was never married.
Yeah, pregnant teenager, and there's all of these kids that we don't know who the mother is, and how does that work as biblical family values? Biblical family values seem to be what the right-wing, good old days, super fundamentalist Christians have decided that biblical family values are.
Right. And it's more based on the 1950s than 33 AD. So who's a woman who is really misunderstood in the Bible?
Lot's nameless wife. Even though most of the women that I covered are either ancestors, families, circle of friends in the parables or in the development of the early church, I couldn't let Lot's nameless wife go unmentioned. Lot invites strangers into the home. When the people of the town want those strangers to know them sexually, he says, oh no, but I have these virgins' daughters. Let me just give you them. I was taught that she disobeyed and she was turned into a pillar of salt because she disobeyed. Well, for heaven's sakes, her husband just said that he would give her children to an angry mob outside. No wonder she looked back. She's being asked to leave her home. She's being asked not to look back. We're told that Lot is such a great host that it was the host's job to take care of these strangers. What kind of biblical family values are that? So she gets a lot of bad press because she didn't do anything other than turn back to check on her children. Now, I don't know if her children were really back there, but...
So who's the woman in the Bible that you think people don't know about, that they should know about?
Well, they don't know about a lot of them or don't actually know their stories except as they fit into the framework of men's stories. Since Easter was just a couple of weeks ago, the restriction against women preaching is rather ludicrous when you think that we wouldn't even know the resurrection story if the women hadn't been there to experience the resurrection and go back and tell the male disciples. I do not believe that the disciples were only male. I believe that they were male and female. Martha, the sister of Mary, made the same declaration about Jesus being the Messiah that Peter did. Salome, who was one of the women at the resurrection, was also the mother of John and James, whom Jesus called the sons of thunder. The last time we see their father, Zebedee, he's sitting in the boat mending the nets. But Salome is confronting Jesus and saying, I want my sons to sit at your right hand and your left hand. I think Salome is the thunder that they were the sons of. All of these interpretations have been done from a male perspective, and the women were doing other things. Mary, the sister of Martha, was sitting at the feet of Jesus as a disciple, and Martha was preparing the table. What if it was the equivalent of a communion table that she was preparing? And we see pictures of the Last Supper, Da Vinci's Last Supper. And I had a Jewish friend of mine say once, what did they think? They got Passover to go? Because the women would have been there. Jesus traveled with his family to Jerusalem. And so women would have been there preparing the Seder. So women were there doing what women do and doing things that women aren't supposed to do, like Junia being an apostle or Priscilla being part of a ministry team, or Mary having a church in her home.
Right.
We've just passed over those stories, and read instead that Peter showed up there because he broke out of jail.
Right.
So we've missed the women's faithful stories.
Right.
And one of my favorite stories about Mary Magdalene is in John, I think it's in John, when the women have gone to the tomb, Jesus is not there, the rest of the women have gone away, a man approaches her, and she thinks it's the gardener, and all of a sudden she realizes in the way he says her name,
Right.
who it is.
Right.
What a touching story of closeness. And I'm not making any, Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. But still, there was a very close relationship there because you know how your mama says your name or your brother says your name or your lover says your name. There's a difference. And that's how she recognized him.
Right.
It's one of my favorite stories.
So, Dr. Paula, I absolutely love this book.
Thank you.
It is wonderful because for me, it introduced me to things I'd never thought about before. And I love the way you do it in a broad brush way where you introduce many concepts and really just whet the palate for people to do further biblical exploration. And it's very easy to do, just going to those passages that you reference in the Bible and reading those passages again and thinking about what the women's story might have been and comparing that to the one that you wrote. What's the one that someone else might write about how that woman might feel? What is your hope with the book? What do you hope the main takeaway is for someone who reads this book, and who should pick up this book and how will it benefit them?
The subtitle is Questioning Teachings About Biblical Women, because that is what I would like people to do. I would especially like for women who are sitting in the pew, as I did for decades, listening to a patriarchal explanation of the women's stories, to read the stories for themselves and to interpret those stories from their own perspective, because women globally have different issues to deal with than I do. So when they read a woman's story, what would it look like from their context, from their perspective? So I would like the women in the pews to read the book and begin to question what they're being taught. I don't think it would be any less spiritual for the women to speak to them directly.
Right. And I love the fact that this book is not trying to tear down the Bible, to tear down Christianity. It's in fact doing very much the opposite. This is one thing I found in my own reading of the Bible and study. What I had been taught, I had pretty much rejected because it didn't make sense to me. It didn't apply to me. I could not understand because it was filtered through really a first century lens. And these were precepts set out and rules set out for people who lived 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And I wasn't taught the values behind the story. I was taught to follow the boundaries laid out in the story. Those boundaries don't work. And you had a great chapter in here where you talk about that, and you invite all of us to reread these stories through a 21st century lens, understanding all of the context of these stories. Who were these people? And it's not just the main character, it's who are all the characters. Because it's not just one person acting alone. These are stories. There are many characters. And if we don't think about the support cast, we're not really understanding the real story.
And I don't think of them as a support cast because I believe that they are as important to the narrative, to the story, as the male characters. It's just that their stories haven't been told in a way that shows the fullness of how important they were or are to the story.
Right.
A woman who does not appear in the book, but I have written her story in my blog, is the Levite's concubine. She had run away from him, and she had run back to her father. and he went to get her, and the father and the Levite, and the Levite was a priest. So the Levite and the father ate and drank for a couple of days, and then she left with him. She was forced to leave with him. And I often wonder what her mother was thinking at the time.
So this story is sort of a parallel to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. So as the Levite and his concubine were headed home, they stopped in a town and were in the town square. Nobody would give them a room for the night. Finally, an old man came by and said, "Hey, you can come stay at my house tonight." Some men in the town came and were pounding on the door, said, "Hey, bring this guy out. We want to have sex with him." And the old man said, "No, let me give you my virgin daughters." The Levite said, "I've got my concubine here." The men were persistent. Finally, the Levite just shoved his concubine out the door.
And then she was raped, and she was found the next morning on the doorstep, and the Levite said, "Get up, let's go." And we don't know if she was dead or if she died on the way or if he killed her. But when he got back to his home, he cut her up in pieces and sent the pieces to all the different tribes of Israel to show them what had been done to him.
Right.
And
it was his property.
Yeah. And I was taught that story, and sitting in church, and this is, the thinking man's church, being reminded that I needed to obey my father and I needed to obey my husband, or that was probably directed toward them, because look what could happen to you if you didn't obey.
Wow.
And that was one of the big reasons that I say questioning teachings about biblical women, because so many of the things that I was taught, when I read the women's stories, I knew that wasn't what the story was about.
Right.
And that's not the way the women would tell their own stories.
Right. So, Dr. Paula, what a wonderful conversation we've had today. What is next for you? Do you see another book? Are you doing speaking engagements, talking about biblical women?
Yes, and yes. The book that I'm working on right now, I was watching the news, and they were interviewing a woman outside an apartment complex. And the interviewer said, "Did you know her?" The interviewee said, "Yes, I knew her. And, well, I'm kind of worried because, well, I'm going through something like that right now. They think her husband killed her, and, well, I'm kind of worried about myself." And the interviewer said, "Thank you very much. And now back to you in the studio." Wow. And now we're back in the studio, and the person in the studio said, "We'll have the latest diet tip right after this commercial break." And I was screaming. Maybe when they went off air, somebody said, "Oh my goodness, let's get you help. Let's go get you packed.
Right.
Let's take you to the shelter. Let's call the police. Let's get a restraining order." But nobody said anything. So it's tentatively called The Religious, Social, and Cultural Response to Another Woman Found Dead. Because after I had seen that news, I started realizing they say that another woman has been found dead. Another child is missing. Another child is missing and presumed dead. And it's another. They say another. And I'm thinking about the Me Too movement and about #enough and all of these violences that happen to people in our culture. And we see it on the news, and it's another school shooting. What? So that's what I'm working on, and it's pretty disturbing. It's pretty disturbing research. You asked me if I was changed after I wrote this. I don't know that I was particularly changed, but I think I will be changed after this next book.
How do you maintain your faith with all the bad and all the evil in the world?
Because the bad and the evil in the world isn't what I have faith in. I like to say I don't have a choice. I just am a woman of faith. I can remember when I was in college walking up the steps to the house that I shared with 4 other women. And I knew I wasn't, I was majoring in religion, but I wasn't particularly doing anything so that anybody would know I was majoring in religion, because it was like 1972 and I was doing what we did in 1972. And I knew that my Creator was walking with me. Wow. So I don't really have a choice. I just am faith. The older I get, the easier it is.
Right.
And I don't think that God makes bad things happen in the world. I think we do.
Right. So if people want to have you come and speak at their church or at a group or find out more about you, how should they get in touch with you?
Email. That's in the back of the book.
And I'll put that in the show notes.
Okay. I also have a blog. I'm trying to get better at blogging. In fact, I'm going to be writing a blog about an experience that I had last weekend. I went to see Cabaret.
Yes.
And at the end of Cabaret, when she's had the abortion, he slaps her. And there were people in the audience that applauded. Shocked me like you can't believe. He slapped her and they applauded.
Wow. I went to see that. I don't recall people applauding, but it may have been something that I just didn't think about coming from my particular perspective on that.
Well, my niece went the next day and I asked her if people applauded then, and she said no. But at least at the performance I went to, at least 3 people applauded.
Wow. We'll definitely look for that blog, and I'll have all those details in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Always
you, Brian.
wonderful to have a discussion with you.
Thank you very much. It was a joy and a pleasure. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening to Be the Bridge. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love a positive rating and review on iTunes. I appreciate your support and feedback. For more details, visit brianpaytonjoyner.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter. The links are in the show notes. Have a great week. And as my grandpa used to say, if you live life by your own rules, you're gonna be okay.